Hello, welcome to my colleagues in Taiwan. We are so happy to have you as a big partner in our deep learning work around the world. And I know we're in the early stages, but so much has been accomplished already. And I'm happy to have this opportunity in the next 40 minutes or so to catch up to a few things on the agenda. One is that this is very much, as you know from our work, a partnership that we work closely with practitioners. In fact, we say that most of our best learning, 80% of it, comes from leading practitioners like you. So we're always learning, even though we're helping you develop. And so this is an important part of that. The second thing is, in this case, as part of this session we have with you, I know you're interested in system change, and we work on clusters of schools such as yours. We certainly work on not only individual schools, but groups of schools. Also, I will say at the local regions or districts as we have them in North America. For deep learning, we're just now starting to work into whole system change with deep learning. And you're interested in that. And that's why I've put together a few slides pushing into that territory where you're able to see what we're able to test out some ideas. You're able to get a picture of this that we can discuss with you and build on. So this is new territory. We did in 2003 to 2013 whole system change with Ontario, the province of Ontario, where we're based. That included literacy for the 5,000 schools, numeracy, high school graduation, whole system change. And so that was quite successful. But now that we get to deep learning, this is much more complex, much more demanding. And so we're really glad to catch you at this part where you just have developed enough that you say, we want to go further. We want to see the whole system in contextual change. So I'm going to review a few things with you. And then at the same time, we will also be able to extend it today. And we will send you you'll have together the PowerPoint slides so you'll be able to see what I've saved. So take a listen and we'll see what this means together and we'll build on it. Thanks very much. So let's get started. Okay, you see on the screen the title slide. It has two concepts, drivers and whole system. So drivers are policies. Right drivers are policies that work. They have the desired impact. We'll take a visit to wrong drivers, which are policies that are supposed to work, but they actually don't have much impact on progress. Then the whole system is really where we're moving with you, is starting with clusters of schools, and then always asking the question sooner than later, what does this mean for the system? Even for the clusters, even if it's a small cluster, you need the system to be compatible. And then you want more than that. You want the whole system to move forward. So that there's impact for the country. So I'm going to take you through some of the things that we have already talked to you about, but I'm going to add things about system change. And so part of this is a review, and the other part is to build on the foundation we already have with you. So the need for change is something that we always look at closely as the point of departure. The picture is not very favorable, and it wasn't favorable, as we will say, even prior to the pandemic in, let's say, December 2019. So the summary of the problem context are these four things: that traditional schooling, the way that we have done schooling for the last 50 or more years, is boring for a lot of students. So let's visit that, see what to do about it. Inequity and inequality are widening from 1980 onward, especially, that a gap gets bigger and bigger in society in terms of financial and being able to cope and live in a complex society with the resources, but it's also in schools. And then the world is troubled. I'll say just in major way, two things. One is the climate, the physical problem, and the other is the social problem, which is the growing distrust that if you take surveys of people responding to the question, how much do you trust other groups in society? You'll see that the figures, I'm thinking of some from the US right now, that were 60% about 45 years ago, are saying, yes, we trust other groups. and now it's about 30% and is going down. So physical problems and social problems. This is why we turned to deep learning, and I hope that's why you turned to deep learning. In ours in 2015, we started this to say the education needs to be different. Remember, this was well before COVID, so this was already a problem. Then the good silver lining, I guess one could say, about COVID is that our goal, your goal, is not just to survive it, but also to use the opportunity as a catalyst to build something bigger and better and deeper. And that makes it, and that the possibilities are there in a way that they weren't. As bad as COVID has been, it's also discombobulated the whole system and allows us to say, okay, what should we do differently? And then I want to just use also as a context this Right Drivers paper I did 11 years ago now almost, in 2011. And you'll see in this starter list that I was there then focusing on quite a bit of the problem of the right drivers. Accountability that was very much not tied into improvement. Individualism, depending on individual teachers and leaders to carry the day instead of working with the group. Technology, which was then coming in, and people were taking on technology, but they weren't figuring out how to use it for learning. And then a lot of ad hoc strategies. We were, and then at that time in Ontario, working on the right drivers, the left side. Capacity building, which is increasing the skills of individuals as well as groups, capacity to make improvements, collaborative work, teamwork, of course, pedagogy as the driver, technology as the accelerator, and systemness. We raised the question, how do you connect this so that it makes sense together? So that was 2011, and now 10 years later, a lot of things have happened, mostly problematic, but they pushed us back into the driver's question. And I'm going to show you later the 2021 drivers that we have. Will be very interesting to see them, I think, and they built on a lot of our work in deep learning as well. So let's go lead into the problem. The main reasons on this slide, and I'm not going to read every slide, you'll have them be able to look at them. But the question here is why aren't we getting progress with students, with students especially are farther behind. And you'll see some of the key, I'll just take the first and the fifth one, the failure to connect students with purpose. What's the purpose of learning for me in this day and age? Or the last one, failure to build relationships and belongingness, absolutely crucial in terms of students as well as teachers. So these are things that got lost along the way, that they are clearly, just by looking at them, good things to do, but they weren't highlighted. What we were doing was focusing on what I eventually called the obsession with academics, getting good grades, going to university, etc. But there wasn't the meaning for students, for most students, as it turns out, majority of students at that time. So then we look at this one of our colleagues at Jal Mehta, who's a sociologist at Harvard, has done some very good work on deep learning. He did a book called In Search of Deep Learning, he and Sarah Fine, and they had a list of secondary schools in the US that were supposed to be doing deep learning. So they spent a year, 2 years actually, going out looking at these schools, examining what are they doing, what are the innovations, and so forth. And at the end of it, they said there's not much here. That's why they called their book In Search of Deep Learning. This was in the period 2017 to 2020. And then they started to say, well, yeah, we see pockets of this, but what's wrong here? And what they called it the yawning gap. I think a great choice of words. The yawning gap between how schools are organized and how students like to learn or what they want to learn. So again, you see these 5 points, opportunities to focus on something that has purpose and meaning, or to go in the fourth one, their identities being valued. I'm a person. Who am I? I want the opportunity to contribute to the world, a big theme that I'll come back to. That's one of the most exciting outcomes of our work together. So that's Mehta, and he did, if you're interested in the research, in addition to his book, which is called In Search of Deep Learning, he did a special issue of the American Journal of Education that was focusing, they invited research papers on deep learning, and they screened them and they published 5 in this issue. And they asked me, actually, one of the to comment on it, and all of us drew the same conclusion. These schools said they're going to do deep learning. They got a little bit further, and then they didn't go. They just didn't develop. So that there was nothing really much happening. I have an article in the American Journal of Education, January 2020. It's a short issue really gives you, if you're research inclined, some of the basic evidence based on that slide. So here's another way of putting it: the problem that there's a big research center at Stanford, and the center is called the Center on the Study of Youth, and they've been examining with a lot of different cohorts of students, what does education mean to you, where are you headed? And in this slide, it's focusing on schools and students in years 11 and 12. So they are 15, 16 to, let's say, 18, 19. And they found with a lot of different groups that when they asked students, what's your purpose now? You're about to graduate. Most of you are going to post-secondary education. The students said, mostly said, well, I want to get a good job. I want to go to a good university, want to get a good job, etc. But when they pushed on purpose, like, what's the purpose of education? What's your purpose? There was only 24% that are really had any idea of that. So I want to say it this way: without question, the majority of students are not well plugged into the purpose of learning, and this has been growing, and now this is most evident in the pandemic, and this is why we're doing deep learning, and hopefully why you're doing it. So some publications, you have these, so I just wanted to remind you that I'm going to, if I start on the right-hand side of this slide and go left, when the pandemic started, 5 or 6 months later, we did a report called Education Reimagined. At the time, we thought it was going to be temporary, maybe 8, 9, 10 months, but it's been double that or more than that. And so in the Education Reimagined, we said, yes, there's disruption. Okay, here's the transition. Make sure you pay attention to a number of things, and then here's where we could go. So that was helpful. People found it. They used the framework. You can go inside that report and find some tools and guidelines for it. And then we did, in the middle one here, we did a short version just recently that is, as people were seriously thinking of coming back, what have you learned? And in this short one called Activate Deep Learning, Lift from Loss, a lot of people were spontaneously saying, oh, we have to make up for the loss, the academic loss. And they started to do a whole bunch of, we should have summer schools and worksheets and all of that. And we and our team warned, as many others did, off that response, because if you take boring schooling and then you intensify it under difficult circumstances, you make matters worse. And so it became very clear that well-being was much more important, in fact, was the key. And this is why we have fused well-being and learning. You'll see that later. And then the other report I did that I referred to that I'll come back to at the end of this presentation is the right drivers for whole system success, a substantial list of what is needed and built around 4 right drivers and 4 drivers that should not be emphasized. So that's where we're heading in this presentation. I did this slide recently, all hands on deck, to remind us that as we go into the future, and you'll hear me later talk about the moonshot, that is to say that this isn't just recovery in a simple way of let's get back to the way it was. This is a kind of a springboard to the future that all through this decade, intensively, increasingly, starting in 2022 and beyond, this is why this session with you today is so important, is that this is this is not a 1-year or a 3-year project. This is why we have now thought about this as not just education makeup, but as developing the whole child for complex society. And this slide, all hands on deck, gives that message. It's taking well-being and learning and fusing it, as we want to call it now. It's taking all people, not just teachers and principals, but parents, mental health workers and others, all part of the well-being learning that I'll come to and that you're in the midst of working. So this is all hands on deck. The short report I showed a few minutes ago that we did a few months ago, the priorities for activating deep learning. The message is lift, not lost. It's lifting above even what we were before and lifting where people are now. So you'll see we have given a number of tips, and when we do workshops, people discuss these 10 ideas and looking for, okay, how do we do number 5? What does that mean? And we might put them in subgroups, and they're very active in this kind of work. So this has been going on now for a few months very strongly on Lift from Lost, and then we now want to come into a more, I guess I'll say, systematic and forceful. Once you get the initial transition back, which is going to happen, let's say by January 2022, you want to really take advantage of what I refer to as the need to re-examine the purpose for learning. The purpose for learning seems to have, by default, I'll say, drifted into academic learning only. And now we want to take back and redefine that. And our whole model is about implementing this. It's to develop learners, all learners, who can engage and thrive in the increasingly complex, demanding universe of the 21st century. So that is what we're doing. That's what you're doing. We have a lot of tools, experience. Remember, we draw from practice to build this up. So that's heading. Just one other idea that I think is helpful is context. Joanne Quinn, the co-developer of the deep learning, she and I did a book in 2015, right at the beginning, that stimulated this work. The book is called Coherence, and it is focusing on these 4 domains: direction or purpose, which is I've been talking a minute ago; collaborative cultures, which is at the heart of deep learning implementation; deepening learning itself. What does that? What does it mean? What are the ins and outs of it? And securing accountability. How do you get accountability and have it actually work instead of it being a negative thing? So this is not 1, 2, 3, 4. This is really a dynamic representation. We like to keep the key ideas, the number of ideas, fairly brief. Instead of having, say, 12 things you better do or whatever, here's 4. The essence, you integrate it. Leadership at all levels is about fostering these connections. So I'll use that as a bit of an organizer as I talk about this. And then at the end, the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to really zero in on the newest work on system change. What are the system change implications? So first on coherence, a very important conclusion that Joanne and I made, which was it's not alignment. It's not saying, okay, it's coherent because this connects to that, to that. That's just a description of it. What was really the difference is when it's in people's minds and hearts, that it's a subjective thing. And more than that, it has to be shared. So just take these words, the shared depth of understanding about the nature of the work. This really is what you get when you implement our strategies. People start to look together, they understand it together, they can talk the walk together, and they're focusing. And then on the purpose, now I'm going to make it a little more dynamic. I said that we need to change the purpose away from just academics to the more how to develop the complexities that are required to thrive and change and develop the future. And we need a dynamic concept for that. And our dynamic concept is forging unity of purpose. This is Mary Parker Fullan in the 1920s, actually, a business leader way ahead of her time, 100 years ago, called forging unity of purpose to be the main task. So this is, I've taken this up in the book called Nuance, that it's really the major part that people have to think about. How do we forge unity of purpose? To do that, you have to collaborate. Obviously, you have to build teams. Leadership has to be enabling those. But the word collaboration has been around for 60, 70 years, more than that if you go into other things, but I'm saying applied to schools. And it hasn't gone very far. There's been pockets of success here and there. It hasn't had much precision. And what's happened, and this is encouraging about the timing of this, in the last 5 years, you could say by coincidence, but I think it's really part of what people are learning, is that coherence has become much more powerful as a concept, much more precise. We use the word strive for precision, but avoid prescription. If you prescribe solutions, people back off, or you don't get them right anyways. But if you forge them together, people can see it. So right now, there's a fundamental part. It's really quadrant 2. Quadrant 1 was deepening the purpose. Quadrant 2 was collaborative cultures. So let's do a brief review, just very brief, but it's very specific on what we've learned in the last 4 or 5 years about collaboration. This is from one of our colleagues, Amanda Datnow, who works in California. She's looked at schools that have high poverty but are especially successful. And she and her co-author Park, they really have done a nice job of pulling out the insights, and they put it in two categories. And I like that because the second category is usually missed. But let's stick with the first. And I won't again do each slide in detail, but just look at the first one. When in these schools that were highly successful, highly challenging, the teachers didn't distinguish between formal and informal collaboration. They didn't say, "Oh, we're collaborating because we have a meeting." They said, "Day after day, this is our culture. We collaborate." So it's what happens in between meeting. That's what the culture of the school is. They were learning from each other. They were focusing on pedagogy. They were striving for continuous improvement. So you see all these things that made it strong. But then they also picked up another theme, which is really crucial these days, and it is about not just the professional side of development, but the emotional support that people give each other, including, I hope you'll notice this in deep learning. I'm sure you're doing it. And sometimes it's protecting teachers against policies that seem to be pushed too hard or are wrong or the timing is wrong. So you get a lot of development, I think, from this, where you realize that when teachers are close together working and the leaders are facilitating this, it is about getting better on the practice side, but it's also to make sure people are doing well. Are they helping each other? Do they feel connected? Is it working? All of those things. This research in the last 5 years has been reinforced by other researchers. One of our colleagues, and you will know Andy Hargreaves, did a great book 2 years ago on collaborative professionalism, where he and O'Connor, his colleague, looked at a lot of examples of networks of schools and said which ones have the strength. And so these are, you can read the findings, but take the first one. It's exactly the key finding from Datnow. The joint work of collaborative professionalism is embedded in the culture and life of the school. Key points: joint, collaborative professionalism, embedded in the culture. And so this is more reinforcement of the kind of work you need to have. And then just to reinforce that this is not about individual schools. In fact, if you go back over the last 40 years, a lot of the research is individual school collaboration, intra-school collaboration, which is useful, but not very good for system change because you need multiple schools learning from each other. So these are some of the indicators that when people work in networks, as you are, that the role is you're leading outside the environment. You're going outside to get better inside. You're contributing. You're expanding, and so it becomes an element of system change that I'll return to. And then another key factor, way of putting this, and this is our own terminology, connected autonomy. We wanted to encompass the individual initiative of people. Autonomy is good, isolation is bad. So autonomy means you have good ideas. And then you're connected. So that's the connected part. Sometimes on a small scale, learn from others, contribute to others. So this is a reminder that it's not just one collaboration that you're thinking of. This is a way of being a teacher or a principal, that your definition of the role is are these things of contributing more widely. And so when we come to leadership, the summary statement, I think, best short way of saying it, is that success occurs when leaders participate as learners with others in the school or across schools to change the culture and consequently the teaching actions and the impact that you have of this. Stepping back from this in a couple of ways, in the fundamentals, I guess I'll say, is that change, successful change, when you think about it, is all about intrinsic motivation. Yeah, you can get success if the incentives are extrinsic incentives are strong enough, but the research the research in this domain is always showing that you can get a degree of success for a short period of time by increasing the external incentives, but you can never get lasting change. It needs to be intrinsic. And the intrinsic motivators, these are Dan Pink is a great psychologist, wrote a book called Drive about 4 years ago. And the first three of these, he emphasized they're exactly what ours are. slightly different words. Sense of purpose, this is the new purpose I'm talking about. Mastery is capacity. A degree of autonomy, I've already underscored that. And connectedness is that belongingness, working together, having a degree of multifaceted connectedness. So that is confirmatory. And then finally, on this initial list of collaborative cultures is the book that Andy and I did in 2012. Very strong review. If you haven't read it, I recommend that you look at it, because we were differentiated between three capitals. Capital is a resource that you can draw on. You can keep using it and get more capital from it. So human capital, the quality of the group. Human capital, the quality of the individual. So that's what the wrong driver was. If you just rely on individuals to save the day, the group doesn't change, and therefore not much impact. But if you combine human capital with social capital, the quality of the group, you start to get collaboration, you start to get multiple impacts, what Datnow and Park found, for example. And then decisional capital, we added this as an important part. It's not just getting together to work on things, it's making decisions that are particular, that are really related to motivation, that related to learning, deep learning, and all of those things. So this is all leading us, I think, in a good, tight direction. And to go back to our diagram, the third part of this, I've just talked about the second part, which are collaborative cultures, is about deep learning. Remember, we said this in 2015, and then we started to do it in 2016. And this is really, and you've been working on this, so I'm not going to give you, that's kind of a quick review, because this is the bread and butter of deep learning, and I know you've been implementing it and drawing on it. So it is about the purpose now. We've linked it into the new purpose, not the boring purpose, but the exciting purpose. It is, and we use the word NPDL for talking about this. It's not so much to say that every pedagogy we talk about is new. There are good old pedagogies, and there are bad new pedagogies, like superficial use of technology. But deep pedagogies are really important. And one of the things I think I'm going to say, one of the strongest features of our model compared to many others is we actually go deep on pedagogy. A lot of ones talk about the goals, and they have some superficial activities, and they talk about future competencies, but they don't, in the black box in the middle, which is pedagogy, they don't go deeply enough into what that is. So we have portrayed that on this slide. It's comparing what pedagogy is in our model, which is on the right part of this slide. And you'll see it's all tied into redefining the learning relationship between students and teachers, the relationship that has to do with partnership, the expansion, and this is being enabled by COVID, to families and community, which is stronger now, or potentially stronger than it was before COVID, the meaningfulness of work and the authentic learning. And that you see it then as a really students being active, not by themselves, but as part of the partnership. And we have formed, as we have in each of our deep learning models, we've tried to define it, and I'll turn to that right now, define it so it's clearly what's involved in it, the specific elements. We've operationalized those elements by having protocols and rubrics that can define them and measure them. We've showed them through your help of videos coming from the schools we work with in the 12 countries, that the videos are showing this in action, and we're able to analyze them according to our model. So I talked about deep learning, and this is where I want to come back to it. The deep learning is about the learning design, the black box of pedagogy, I want to call it. So it is a pedagogical practices. That slide I just showed you comparing the old teaching model and the new partnership. It is about learning partnerships. It's about changing and expanding the learning environment. It's about leveraging digital. Now that technology, remember, was a bad driver before, because it was trying to impose itself on it without thinking about learning. Now we've got learning in charge, and we can easily relate it to technology. Technology has become even more powerful during the pandemic. And then the deep learning, and I'm not going to separately look at this. This is our 6 C's: the character and citizenship and collaboration and communication, creativity and critical thinking, and especially character and citizenship. And these words, sometimes character doesn't translate so much easily from English, other words, but character in all of these cases, we have the protocols, we have the definition, 4 or 5 key subdimensions for each of the 6 Cs, and they are what we focus on, what we measure, what we link to the learning design that you see here. And then the full model, which I'm leading towards what you're wanting to look at anew, is this. What we've done with our model, look at the bottom part, the foundation. We've added this foundation explicitly. It was there before, but now we put it, the new purpose for learning, global competencies for flourishing in a complex world. And then you get into the model, the 6 Cs, the 4 elements of the design, and then the infrastructure, which you could call the culture of the school and the system. That infrastructure is within the school, within the local region or municipality, and for the system as a whole. I said at the beginning that we've done quite a good job of looking at the school conditions and in some ways the district conditions or the regional, but we haven't done so much on the system conditions. And this is why we welcomed your invitation to me to speak about this today. We have to do the work. Remember, we're learning from practice. So we need this. Our next phase is going to do all of this, but it's especially going to go deeper on the conditions, including system conditions. So to get at the system conditions, I did a book last year with Mary Jean Gallagher, who is one of our used to be head of literacy and numeracy in Ontario at the Ministry of Education. And we worked on system change for that work. So we got together, we published a book with Corwin. It's called The Devil is in the Details. And in it, we used this model to capture what's the lay of the land. Andy Hargraves has also talked about this. Sometimes we call it leadership from the middle. So if you just think in simple terms, the local is the first level, school, individual, school, and community. Then you have the municipality, which is the middle, or the school district. Then you have the policy level, just those 3 levels. So this is a bit dynamic, and I'm going to give you a couple more descriptive slides before we finish. But think about this. We like to think of getting the middle becoming stronger. So if we think of your cluster of schools, 18, 24, whatever the number is going to be, the middle are those schools learning from each other laterally, informing the rest of the system what the role of the middle is, as well as the individual schools, but what can the group do? And to put it in just simply 3 powerful statements, one is we want to think about liberating downward. So wherever you are in that, if you're in the middle, how do you liberate schools, teachers, and parents and students to implement deep learning? So it's liberate downward. When you look upward, we don't want people to say, well, I'm supposed to implement what they tell me to do. We want a more proactive, critical questioning. So we call it exploitation in the best sense of that word. How do I exploit policies at the center level, which can be used for developing at the local level best? We say you may be stuck with the policy, but you're not stuck with the mindset. You can have your own mindset. So remember, liberate downward, exploit upward. And then we say lateralize learning everywhere at every level. That's peer learning is where the strength comes from. So a few more key points to pull this together. This is the newest driver representation. We have a substantial report. It's really detailed in some ways, but do read it through. You'll see that on the right-hand side, I've said that the wrong drivers that have carried over since 2011, now this is a decade later, is that overemphasis on academic grades and neglect of the human element. The way in which machine intelligence, which has powerful potential, but also has a life of imposing on us, it is. The whole new fascinating analysis by economists that about what's been happening with the economy in the last 60 years. And so in the last 3 years, there have been 5 new books by, it turns out, women economists who have questioned how GDP has distorted the last 40 years by, yes, GDP has gone up most years, 2 to 3%, and has created wealth for the nations. But most of that profit has gone to the owners and to ownership and to capital, which are people, the workers. They're getting a lot less of that profit So if you accumulate that over 40 years, you get this great gap, and this is what we have now. Even in strict economic terms, these researchers have really portrayed how we can look at it differently and think of investing money, because we are talking about money, a new monetary policy, which I take up in the report, and then the fragmentation there. So now let's switch over to the positive side, which are the right drivers. Much more complicated, but still only four. And it's now about well-being and learning. What does that mean to put that together? It's about social intelligence, which is a more powerful foundation for collaboration. It's about equality investments, new monetary theory. Read the report, read what's happening with Joe Biden, for example, who's following this kind of work. There are a lot of complications in there. It's just not investing money. It's targeting that for particulars, really the particulars in deep learning. And systemness, which is a tricky concept, and I'm going to turn to that as I end in these last 6 or 7 slides. It is the system. By the system leadership, we don't mean people who happen to sit at the top. They will never get it right. They're too detached, and you can't run it from that. But you also can't say, okay, the local level should have full control, because then you get fragmentation, and it doesn't really go anywhere. So what you have to do, think of the 3 levels again, are that whatever level you're at, the local, the middle, or the top, you need to think about, how do I think laterally with my colleagues at that level about the system? How do I learn about what's working, what's not working? But also, how do I cross levels so that I'm working in partnership, or that I have empathy for other levels and they have empathy? It's really connected autonomy writ large. So this is the brand new territory, and it's just the very beginning. I'm happy to say that take OECD level, other levels, there's a great movement that just has been, it's been brewing, but it's really coming into the force for just these last 3 or 4 months. And that movement is to question how we should change systems differently, what we need to do differently, and how we, for example, standardized tests. There's now almost an inevitable push that standardized tests are going to be replaced by something. What's that something? Then that's what we're working on. That's what others are working on. New metrics, it's called sometimes. And that includes measuring the 6 C's differently, making them thought about as outcomes for going into society. So I think the best way to say this is, we know the elements, and you see them on that screen, the human paradigm. We know that they work, and we can find pockets of it, but how do we enable them to go to scale? And this is where I want to get more problematic with you, but also give you insights about what the do's and the don'ts are. So I'm starting with the don'ts. And we are working in an interrelated way. There's several, I guess I'll say, countries or subsets that are trying to get deep learning. For example, Scotland, with its groups of 4 different quadrants in the country, all built around collaboration. There are other countries that are really trying to make system change their focus. And if we're not careful, you can start out to do something good and end up falling back into the status quo. In fact, I would say the chances are, because those research we and others have done that have looked at the last 100 years, for that matter, is that there's really kind of a stagnation, that you change a little bit, but you don't change the fundamentals. So it's absorbing these changes that are superficial but not deep. That's why we call it deep learning. They have to be deep to change the system and make it different. So when I think about this and look at it, here's the warning list, that sometimes, even though we're all talking about well-being and social emotional learning, sometimes SEL is being added simply as an add-on. So you get piecemeal changes. Technology that we see now, technology is new one, coming out of COVID experience, that are making all kinds of data and ideas available to schools. But so the sheer amount of information is rapidly available, but it's not necessarily deeper if we apply our deep learning model. And we worry about that the technology is present, it's superficially satisfying, but it really isn't deep. The big black box, I call it, of pedagogical change, it's also being the depth of it is a big change in the culture. You can't just have a few items in there and say, we've got it going. You have to be critical about how well you're doing it. There's a failure to make global competency the core focus. They can get easily lost in the shuffle. Systemness, you can layer on all these things. This is going to get us systemness, and what it becomes is hard to understand for practitioners. So it adds confusion. We say strive for complexity and achieving clutter. So you get mixed up from that. And you get things that are rationally sound. Remember my distinction for coherence. It's the shared depth of understanding. It's internal. It's not a descriptive thing, which would be alignment. It's a subjective thing, which are a group of people working together. And so it might not be strong enough. So that's to worry about. And then what to focus on, I would say this is one way of putting it. I've put the system elements here just as a way of describing what we're facing. I haven't made them, the three of them interact, which they need to. But the three elements of system change that have to be there, one is that we're focusing on, indeed, the three levels, the local, the middle, and the state. The second one is that the content of the focus has to be about deep learning. I just replicated there in that middle part of the diagram, the deep learning. And then the third one is the hardest, because it's the change element that you have to, if you take the first two components here, the system process has to engage people in co-determining how to implement this, what the implementation is, what the impact is. So in another diagram in the future, I'll put more dynamic lines in here. But this is the content of what I hope you're wanting to face when you think about change. Make sure that all three part of that. To reinforce the third one is to talk about this way. It's really the change strategy is a dynamic, jointly determined proposition where people are working together on what I've been talking about up to this point. It's the forging of unity of purpose. It's the interactive adaptability to make sure that the specifics are attended to. In evaluation terms, I've used the phrase user-involved reflective evaluation, a bit of a mouthful, but it means that it's not just the people at the top evaluating it, it's people doing it. And then when I tried to do a more comprehensive positive version, this will be the next slide, what I basically did from the Right Drivers paper is to pull out this development of the what I call the new paradigm in 2021, and said, okay, if we would, when I did that report, I didn't do it as an implementation framework. I did it as this should happen, please discuss, and then use that as the point of departure. So this is the complication of it, and I want to spend a few minutes as we end here just talking about how these 8 things have to interact. You can use it as a checklist later, that you have to mobilize leadership among all ages and among all levels. So leadership on this very agenda. A small number of key priorities. We've got them in our model. It's the deep learning model. You have to build relationships and trust within and between levels. So that's again in our model. You have to translate leaders into integrators. This is a very important way of putting it. The leaders are not above all of this saying, I'm implementing deep learning. They are integrating people implementing learning. They're learning from it as well as contributing to the learning. Number 5, be a mentor for some and a protege for others. By that I mean, as a leader, you have to help others learn, but also as a leader, you have to be a learner. This is the protege. I'm a learner. I can learn from the community, from students. Precision about avoiding that getting more and more precision, but don't make the mistake of, okay, we know what we want, now we're going to make sure people do it by imposing it. Number 7, absolutely crucial, fuse. That's the word, not integrate, but fuse, well-being and learning. This is what we're working on. And number 8, build explicit two-way links to the wider municipal and state agenda. And by that, I mean, you've got the education agenda, but at the same time, when I'm thinking of some of the jurisdictions we're working with, municipalities are involved and say, we want this from our educational system. So the educational system should not be a passive recipient of what the society is talking about. We should shift it so the education system is a proactive partner helping to implement the learning agenda for the whole country, and not just in relation to education, but in relation to societal well-being. And so and so finally, just as a reminder, I want to say that this is the human paradigm is what we wanted to make it come alive. Our model for change is very much steeped in those four elements on the left hand side, and that the idea is to make it dynamic. So let's think of it this way: we have to enable the rise of the four right drivers, and then not get rid of the drivers that have been problematic, but put them so that they're in a relationship that helps to move forward. Machine intelligence, for example, can help us move forward, or or some of the the developments of academic development certainly can help us. And so this is our theme. We got it from you all, working with students, especially engage the world, change the world. That's what this is all about. So I hope you will have, I know you will have a great conference. And I want to say that this is not an ordinary conference, mainly because of its timing and where we are, 2021. This is what we call the moonshot decade, that is going to take 2022 and the years in this decade, especially the first 3 or 4 years to get established. This is a long-term change project, but it's got focus, and it's got some initial timeline, and big changes could happen in short periods of time. The acceleration of change, once the things click together, can be very exciting, and we want to be part of it with you. So have a great conference, but we'll go beyond that to a lot of other new things. Thank you.